not partially disrupted, not subject to elevated risk warnings, not operating under convoy protocols while naval commanders assess the situation. Closed in the operational sense that matters most to the global economy. Because no commercial insurer on Earth will currently write a policy for a vessel attempting to transit it. And without insurance, ships do not move. That is not a projection. That is not a worst-case scenario being modeled by analysts. That is the present condition of the waterway through which 20% of all the oil traded on Earth is supposed to flow every single day. And the United States Navy, the force that has guaranteed the openness of that waterway for 5 decades, is discovering in real time that the tools it has available do not match the problem Iran has created. Welcome to Jang Insight. If you want analysis that goes beneath the surface of this crisis, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because what is happening in the Strait right now is more structurally serious than anything the major networks are conveying. Let's start with what we actually know. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Inside that 21-mile gap, the navigable shipping lane, the corridor deep enough and wide enough for a fully loaded supertanker, measures approximately 2 miles in each direction, with a 2-mile buffer between them. 6 miles of functional waterway inside a channel you could drive across in 20 minutes on an American highway. Through those 6 miles, 20 million barrels of oil move every single day. That figure is so routinely cited that it has lost its power to shock. So translate it, 20 million barrels is every barrel of oil that powers every factory, every vehicle, every power station, and every fertilizer plant, serving roughly 1/5 of the planet's energy needs, moving through a gap that a midget submarine can reach in the dark every day, without exception. Until now, the 1973 Arab oil embargo removed 7% of global oil supply from the market. 7%. That reduction triggered the worst American recession since the Great Depression. Gasoline rationing, a stock market collapse, mass layoffs, and a political crisis that reshaped American energy policy for a generation. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly 3 times that share, and Iran has now closed it. Iran has been preparing for this moment since the tanker war of the 1980s, when it first demonstrated that Gulf shipping disruption was a viable asymmetric weapon against a militarily superior opponent. It studied the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the American frigate nearly sunk by an Iranian mine in 1988, which triggered Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval surface engagement since World War II. It drew a precise lesson from that episode. Direct damage to American military assets produces an overwhelming response. Indirect disruption of commercial confidence through area denial does not, or at least it has not yet. 35 years of preparation have produced the threat the U.S. Navy is now confronting. And that preparation has been specifically engineered to defeat the response options America assumed it had available. And this is where things get worse. Layer 1. Why the U.S. Navy's response capability does not match the problem. On the surface, American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf looks overwhelming. The Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, operates some of the most capable surface combatants in the world. Carrier strike groups can project air power across the entire region. The United States has more advanced military technology in this theater than any other nation on Earth. But underneath that surface, a specific and serious capability gap is now visible. The U.S. Navy's active minesweeping fleet consists of 8 Avenger-class mine countermeasure vessels. 8. They are effective platforms, purpose-built for exactly this mission, but they are 8 ships operating against a mine threat dispersed across a body of water that includes deep channels, shallow coastal zones, and mid-strait open water simultaneously. The mathematics of that problem are not favorable. Military analysts who have studied Gulf mine clearance operations in detail estimate that achieving the level of confidence required to restore commercial shipping, not certainty, but sufficient confidence for Lloyd's of London to reopen war risk coverage would require a minimum of 6 months of continuous minesweeping operations under ideal conditions. Not 6 days, not 6 weeks, 6 months. The conditions are not ideal. Iran's mine deployment capability has not been neutralized. Its midget submarine fleet, small quiet vessels capable of deploying mines at night in deep water, remains operational. Defense experts understand that the precise locations of those submarines and the full extent of what they have already deployed are not known with confidence by U.S. naval intelligence. Not approximately known, genuinely unknown. The U.S. Navy can clear mines. It cannot clear mines faster than Iran can redeploy them without first neutralizing the redeployment capability. And neutralizing that capability means striking Iranian territory, which means a different category of conflict entirely. Layer 2. Iran's escalation logic and why it believes it is winning this phase. Iran has not acted irrationally here. It has acted according to a calculated escalation logic that American policymakers underestimated. Try and is clearer the more carefully you examine it. Iran's mine strategy accomplishes 4 objectives simultaneously, without crossing the threshold that would trigger a full American military response. First, it imposes massive economic costs on the global economy. Costs that land on American consumers, European households, and Asian manufacturing economies with no Iranian military asset having to engage an American one directly. Second, it demonstrates to the domestic Iranian audience, to the bank, and to the broader Muslim world that Iran can challenge American military supremacy in its own neighborhood without being immediately destroyed. Third, it creates negotiating leverage that didn't exist 30 days ago. Left from on lever, sambar or power or by that can be traded for sanctions relief, for nuclear concessions, for American military posture changes in the region, at a moment of Iran's choosing. Fourth, it tests American resolve and coalition cohesion at a moment when both are under strain from simultaneous pressures elsewhere. Intelligence reports suggest that Iranian military planners assess the probability of a full American military response to the mining operation, as opposed to a minesweeping response, at below 30%. They calculated that the political cost to Washington of initiating a war with Iran at a moment of elevated domestic economic pressure and simultaneous commitments in the Pacific and in Eastern Europe was higher than the administration was prepared to absorb. That calculation appears so far to have been correct. Iran is not escalating blindly. It is escalating along a path it has mapped carefully. And it believes, based on the American response so far, that it has mapped it correctly. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Layer the economic transmission, how the Strait's closure is landing in ordinary households right now. Pentagon officials have stated that the United States, as a major domestic oil producer, is insulated from the direct supply impact of a Hormuz disruption. What they have not stated clearly enough in language the public actually understands is that oil is a globally priced commodity. It does not matter where the oil comes from. What matters is the global price at which it trades. And that global price is being set right now by the Hormuz disruption, regardless of where any individual barrel originates. In the 2 weeks since the closure became operationally real, the global oil price benchmark has risen by approximately $22 per barrel. Translate that number. A $22 per barrel increase in global oil prices adds roughly $0.52 to the cost of every gallon of gasoline at an American pump. It adds approximately $180 to the annual heating oil cost of a family in the American Northeast. It adds to the diesel cost that moves every food shipment from farm to distribution center to grocery store shelf, a cost that arrives in household grocery bills within 30 to 60 days of the wholesale price change. For an ordinary American family already managing elevated costs from the previous 2 years of inflation, this is not an abstract geopolitical event. It is a concrete reduction in purchasing power arriving through the gas pump and the grocery receipt. The mines are in the Strait of Hormuz. The economic consequence is at the kitchen table, and that is only the American household. For Japan, which imports 85% of its oil through Hormuz, and for South Korea, whose semiconductor manufacturing runs on Gulf energy, the numbers are not 0.52 per gallon. They are existential in a way that is producing emergency cabinet sessions and diplomatic escalations that are not yet fully visible in Western press coverage. Layer 4. The coalition fracture, when allied interests diverge under pressure. The Western response to this crisis has been presented publicly as unified. American, British, French, and allied naval assets are coordinating. Statements from NATO capitals have been aligned. The diplomatic front appears solid, but underneath that surface, the allied coalition is experiencing fracture pressures that have not yet broken into public view, and that Iran understands and is actively working to accelerate. Consider two allied decision makers. Call them the French energy minister and the Japanese trade minister. Same crisis, completely different immediate pressures. France generates approximately 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, making it significantly less exposed to gas price spikes than Germany or Italy. But France's industrial sector, its chemical industry, its agricultural supply chain, all depend on oil-derived inputs whose prices are rising sharply. The French political environment, already volatile, is absorbing an energy cost shock at a moment when the government has minimal political margin. The French calculus on how long to sustain a military confrontation posture with Iran, as opposed to pursuing a negotiated opening, is different from Washington's. Japan's calculus is different still. Japan has no domestic oil production of significance. It has no alternative energy infrastructure at the scale required to substitute for Gulf imports in any meaningful time frame. It has a constitution that, until very recently, restricted military force projection. And it has an economy whose export competitiveness, the thing that funds Japanese prosperity, Pen atin Saturn som jen chin chim matin kin manufacturing chin ting kain ting ki processes that cannot run without the energy currently not flowing through the strait. Tokyo's tolerance for a prolonged military standoff is not measured in months. It is measured in weeks. When allied interests diverge this sharply under sustained economic pressure, coalitions develop fault lines. Iran knows this. Its strategy is partly designed to exploit exactly this divergence, to hold the crisis open long enough that the economic cost forces one or more allied governments toward a separate engagement with Tehran that fractures the unified Western posture. And here is the dimension that almost no one is discussing. Layer 5. What China's position in this crisis actually means. That's the most important variable Washington is not controlling. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the Gulf. It has more at stake economically from a sustained Hormuz closure than almost any other nation on Earth. And yet, China has not joined the allied naval response. It has not condemned Iran's mine operations. It has not offered to use its significant diplomatic leverage in Tehran to press for a resolution. On the surface, this looks like opportunistic neutrality. China watching a crisis that damages Western credibility while staying out of the line of fire. But underneath that surface, China's position is more actively consequential than neutrality implies. China has continued purchasing Iranian oil throughout this crisis, using its shadow tanker fleet and yuan-denominated payment systems to route around the sanctions architecture. That continued purchasing is providing Iran with the revenue stream that makes the economic cost of sustaining the strait closure manageable for Tehran. Without Chinese oil purchases, Iran's foreign exchange position would deteriorate significantly within 60 to 90 days. Creating internal economic pressure that might force an earlier resolution. China is not a neutral bystander. It is an active participant in the economic calculus that is allowing Iran to sustain this crisis. And the United States, which needs Chinese cooperation on the Iran file, while simultaneously competing with China in the Pacific, managing trade tensions, and running a $36 trillion national debt that requires continued foreign demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Is not in a position to apply the pressure on Beijing that the situation logically requires. The Strait of Hormuz crisis and the US-China strategic competition are not separate problems. They are the same problem expressing itself in two theaters simultaneously. Act 4. Options Enumeration 13 odd or 1530. So what are the options? Because serious people in the Pentagon, the State Department, and allied defense ministries are working that question with genuine urgency. Option 1. Conduct a direct military strike on Iran's mine deployment infrastructure, its midget submarine bases, its naval mine storage and handling facilities, its coastal launch platforms. The logic is straightforward. You cannot clear mines faster than Iran can redeploy them without eliminating the redeployment capacity. This is the most militarily coherent option on the table. The problem is that striking Iranian territory initiates a war whose geographic and temporal scope no analyst can bound with confidence. Iranian retaliatory capacity through Hezbollah in Lebanon, through Houthi forces in Yemen, through direct ballistic missile strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure. All of it activates simultaneously. The war to protect Gulf energy infrastructure would, in its opening hours, threaten Gulf energy infrastructure directly. Option 2, establish a full naval convoy system, military escort, for every commercial vessel attempting Hormuz transit, modeled on the 1987 Kuwaiti tanker reflagging operation, where American naval escorts brought reflagged tankers through Iranian-mined waters. That operation worked under conditions of lower mine sophistication and a less capable Iranian submarine fleet. The same approach today carries significantly higher risk of an incident that escalates beyond convoy protection into direct combat. But it is the option most likely to partially restore oil flow without triggering the full regional war that everyone is trying to avoid. Option 3, pursue an emergency diplomatic engagement with Iran. Direct, high level, with concessions pre-authorized that have previously been off the table. The economic cost of a sustained Hormuz closure to the global economy runs into hundreds of billions of dollars per month. At what point does that cost justify concessions that would have been considered unacceptable 60 days ago? That calculation is being made in real time, in multiple capitals. The problem is that Iran, having successfully imposed those costs without suffering a devastating military response, now has every incentive to hold its position and extract the maximum concession value the crisis has created. Option 4, activate a coordinated drawdown of strategic petroleum reserves across the US, the EU, and the IEA member states at sufficient scale to suppress the oil price spike while minesweeping and convoy operations proceed. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently holds approximately 350 million barrels, roughly 17 days of total American consumption. A sustained Hormuz closure lasting months would exhaust that buffer. Strategic reserves are a bridge, not a solution. They buy time. They do not resolve the underlying problem. Option 5 is the assessment no briefing room wants to produce openly. The current set of tools available to Washington, minesweeping capacity, convoy operations, strategic reserves, and diplomatic pressure, is not sufficient to resolve this crisis in a time frame that avoids significant and sustained economic damage. Resolving it decisively requires either a military escalation that carries unacceptable regional war risk, or a diplomatic concession package that rewards Iran for the most aggressive act of maritime disruption since the Second World War. Both options carry costs that no administration finds easy to accept. The crisis may therefore persist at significant ongoing cost until one side's internal pressures force a move. ACET 5, Structural Revelation, 1530 to 17 bomb. So now, let us zoom out from the immediate crisis and look at what it reveals about the system underneath it. This is not a story about Iranian naval capability or American minesweeping limitations. It is a story about a structural assumption that has organized the global economic order for 50 years, and that is now being tested against operational reality. The assumption is this, that American military dominance in the Persian Gulf constitutes a reliable guarantee that that the global oil supply chain will function regardless of the actions of any regional adversary. That the Fifth Fleet, the carrier strike groups, the air power, and the intelligence networks represent a deterrent so credible that no rational state actor would test it through sustained escalatory action against the strait. Iran has just tested that assumption, and what it has found is that the deterrent has a gap in it, a specific exploitable gap between the threshold of action that triggers overwhelming American military response and the level of disruption that imposes massive economic costs on the global economy. Mine warfare in a commercial shipping lane sits precisely in that gap. It is severe enough to shut down global oil flows. It is ambiguous enough, deniable, gradual, technically complex, to avoid crossing the clean threshold that would produce an unambiguous and decisive American response. Defense experts who have studied asymmetric warfare in maritime environments have known this gap existed. The 1988 Operation Praying Mantis was the last time it was seriously tested. In the 35 years since, Iran upgraded its mine technology, expanded its submarine fleet, and developed the doctrine that has now been deployed. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's minesweeping fleet did not grow. It shrank from 14 Avenger-class vessels in the 1990s to 8 today, because the assumption was that deterrence made the capability less necessary. The gap between deterrence assumption and operational capability is the structural failure this crisis has revealed. It is not a failure of American courage or commitment. It is a failure of institutional imagination, the predictable result of designing a military posture around an assumption of deterrence rather than stress testing that assumption against a determined adversary's actual preparation. This is not a contained regional naval crisis. It is a structural revelation about the distance between what American military dominance promises to the global order and what it can currently deliver against a specific category of asymmetric threat. That distance is what Iran crossed when it escalated. And the question of how America closes that distance, if it can, is the question that will define the strategic landscape for the next decade. AC 6, cliffhanger, close. Something sort Barch send me. So, here's where this stands right now. The Strait of Hormuz remains operationally closed to commercial shipping. Lloyd's of London war risk coverage for Hormuz transiting vessels has not been restored. Global oil prices are approximately $22 per barrel above pre-crisis levels and rising. The 8 Avenger-class minesweepers are active, but operating against a threat environment whose full extent remains unverified. Iran has not stood down its mine deployment capability. And the Allied coalition, publicly unified, is experiencing internal economic pressure from France, Japan, South Korea, and India that is not yet visible in the diplomatic statements, but is very visible in the private communications between capitals. The questions this crisis leaves open are the ones with the highest stakes. If the minesweeping timeline runs to 6 months under ideal conditions, and conditions are not ideal, at what point do Allied governments under domestic economic pressure break from Washington's posture and pursue separate diplomatic engagements with Tehran, fracturing the coalition that is the primary non-military tool available? If China continues providing Iran with the oil revenue that makes the economic cost of sustaining the closure manageable, and the U.S. cannot apply sufficient pressure on Beijing without triggering a separate escalation in the Pacific, what leverage does Washington actually hold to force a resolution? And if this crisis runs into its 3rd or 4th month without resolution, which comes first? The exhaustion of Allied strategic petroleum reserves, or the domestic political collapse of a coalition government in a major European ally? None of those questions have comfortable answers today. All of them are being worked through in secure facilities in Washington, London, Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels by people who understand that the Strait of Hormuz is not a regional waterway. It is the load-bearing point of the global economy. Iran has escalated against it. The U.S. Navy is struggling to respond, and the clock on every allied government's political patience is already running. Stay with Jong Insight. This crisis is not over. It has barely begun.